Think beyond traditional business banking. Think a partner that gives you in-depth financial insights.
Well, the agenda on the power table today is AGOA, formerly known as the African Growth Opportunity Act. And this follows the 2023 AGOA Forum that was hosted by South Africa ahead of the expiry of the current term in September 2025. Of course, you also know that discussions are currently underway on the prospect of extending the trade deal. So in the next half hour, we'll essentially be reviewing how impactful the preferential trade deal has been. It provides tariff-free access on certain goods from 35 countries in Africa to the US. And we'll find out exactly how it has benefited both parties since it was established in 2000. We'll also look at what changes may and should be forthcoming should policymakers approve an extended term. I am joined at the table today by Azar Jammine, Director and a Chief Economist at Econometrix, François Conradie, a lead political economist over at Oxford Economics Africa, Snyders, Industry Specialist at Standard Bank Research, as well as Eckart, Naumann, economist at Tralac. Gentlemen, thanks so much for your time. Eckart, I want to start off with you. I have heard some of your commentary in South African media just post the AGOA summit taking place. I've heard that you've attended quite a few of the AGOA summits in the recent while since the trade pact was established. In your view, if we dial back to 2000 and if we throw forward to what has happened now, how impactful has AGOA been for Africa?
Well, AGOA has been very impactful. It's been very impactful for a number of countries, not for all. I think that needs to be acknowledged. It is a unilateral trade preference arrangement of the United States. It's not a trade agreement, so nothing was signed or negotiated between African countries and the United States. And essentially what it does is it provides African eligible countries with de facto duty-free access to the United States market. And it combines that, the AGOA preferences, with those preferences that were already in existence before then under the GSP. So certainly South Africa has been a major beneficiary, has probably been the largest beneficiary country of all, has the most diversified export palette. Perhaps purely in terms of numbers, and unfortunately oil is one of those AGOA products that always throws the details a little bit, or the magnitude of the impact a little bit. But if we take that out, certainly South Africa has been the largest beneficiary and has and exports a very diverse palette of goods to the United States duty-free under AGOA, and certainly that gives it an important competitive advantage. But certainly South Africa is not the only beneficiary. Kenya, Lesotho, Madagascar, Tanzania, Nigeria, there are a number of countries that have really benefited from this arrangement.
As you said, Eckart, coming back to you, said it has been beneficial for some, but not all countries in Africa. So for those that have not benefited to the same degree or a similar degree, in your view, why has that been the case?
Well, I think it's how do we measure benefits and how do we measure AGOA utilization? We need to remember that about 40% of total US tariff lines that are possible to be imported into the United States are already duty-free without AGOA. They don't need AGOA. So if trade happens under those, that is not a reflection on AGOA. It is still an important export from an African country. And I think we need to not so much look at what are the weaknesses of the AGOA legislation, because I think there are not that many flaws in it. And I think many of these, can be back down to supply side constraints, the cost of logistics, especially for landlocked countries, inefficient border processes, trade facilitation issues. And then, of course, exporting is not for sissies. It's a difficult process. The US regulatory environment is not simple. And I think those are natural barriers that make exporting challenging, especially for SMEs, but certainly not any less fruitful once they master that process.
Okay. Andre, coming to you, just as a financier, perhaps if you can also describe the kind of activity that you have seen from an export point of view from AGOA and companies here in South Africa or the continent wanting to export a lot more of their goods to the US. How would you describe that activity in the recent while?
If we look at the industries that are really involved in AGOA, you'd have to say automotive and textiles are some of the biggest ones. So South Africa, we manufacture quite a few cars here, and we export those to different parts of the world, including the United States. So that's a very important export market for us. That's automotive. If you look at other countries outside of SA, also in AGOA, textiles, if we take Lesotho as an example, textile exports to the US would be very important as well. Then, of course, there are all sorts of agricultural products, machinery. It's quite widespread, but Africa's exports generally are not very diversified. They're quite concentrated in a small number of tariff lines. So there's actually a lot more room for more industries to get involved if they can develop export potential and if they can grow a market in the United States. As Eckart was saying, it takes a lot of effort for companies to go over there. I know the citrus industry, for example, in South Africa, has done a lot of work to develop contacts with important US players, not just at the company level, but at the state level. And that's literally bearing fruit. It's working well. And we hope to see more industries. As a bank, obviously, we're interested in far beyond South Africa. And trade growth is a really good indicator of general growth.
Sure. Because, Andre, one of the topics that are being discussed more closely right now is the type and the quality of those exports. African countries are all wanting a lot more bang for their buck and saying that they want a lot of the exports to be sort of finished goods, manufactured goods, as opposed to the raw materials that are currently dominating in the basket that goes out and is shipped out to the US. And I'm just interested in your thoughts as a bank. I mean, the growing conversations around beneficiating more on the continent. As a bank, do you see that as an opportunity or a risk?
We definitely see it as an opportunity. And some African countries have made progress toward exporting more finished products. But generally, if you want to do mass production, you need all sorts of other mass things like mass transportation, you need grid energy, you need mass education, and very often those networks in Africa are quite poor. So even if you do manage to create a good finished product in Africa, it's very expensive, as Eckart was saying, and very difficult, just physically difficult, getting it from your factory to the port, through the port, and into the US. And at that point, you've lost most of your cost advantage. It's interesting to look at what South Africa has done. And basically, we import so that we can export. We don't try and do it all here and then export it. So we're doubly exposed to trade. And our machinery and automotive is a good example. We just add the value here in many cases, and then we re-export. So I think there's definitely progress made. We see it as an opportunity. Of course, there are risks, but there's a long way to go in building those primary networks before Africa can really look at exporting more finished products.
Okay. Francois, you published a note just posting your views on the conference that did take place in South Africa, and it's headlined that you are expecting AGOA to be extended. It's likely to be extended, although conditions may change, and you actually go further to say that we could see AGOA being used more aggressively to advance Washington's political aims. So as we go into the part of extension right now and what the extended AGOA is likely to include or perhaps even drop from the previous term, just explain your thoughts there and what you mean by it being used more aggressively to advance Washington's political aims.
Yes, thanks, Fifi. So it's very, there are a lot of moving parts here because it's part of all of this is happening at a complicated time in US politics. The next year is an election year, but broadly, I mean, you can tell from the way specific Congress people have been speaking, and the two of them have been very prominent, is Chris Coons and Jim Risch. you can tell that they've been unhappy now as legislators with the way that the executive branch in America has not used this opportunity, this lever that they have through AGOA to press South Africa more forcefully to align with the US on specific questions of geopolitics. Now, it was Russia, and now more lately, they are very unhappy with the fact that our international relations minister Naledi Pandor spoke to Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas and Iran. And we've been explaining things, but so broadly, the legislators want this tool to be used more forcefully to press African countries to align with the US on questions of politics more and more. And it's also, you can also see how a shift has been taking place on the reasons for countries losing their designation to be eligible for these AGOA benefits. Where in previous instances it was very much about labor rights and rights in the general sense. Now it's becoming a little narrow. So in South Africa's case, they're talking about our losing our designation because we're not aligning with the US on these policy issues. And in the case of Uganda, which is going to lose its designation in January, it's because of an anti-homosexuality law, nothing to do with labor rights. So the focus of this tool of designating or not designating a country is going to be used if AGOA is extended, which I expect it will be. You're going to see more of a focus on stuff like that, like policy directions in the geopolitical sense, as well as labor rights. But I think the focus is going to become increasingly on broader policy inclinations and the US wanting countries to signal that African countries are on their side.
Sure. I mean, it's Uganda, it's Niger, it's the Central African Republic, as well as Gabon, who are at risk of being kicked out. But Francois, just coming back to you then, citing the two individuals in US Congress that you have mentioned that are not happy with South Africa, particularly on our political stance when it does come to the Russia-Ukraine war, as well as what's currently going on in the Middle East. These are two individuals. I don't know, maybe more feel the same way that they do that we don't know about. But I just want to understand from your point of view how impactful you think that these two, or perhaps slightly more, could be in influencing the ultimate decision on the new additions as to whether countries must comply to a certain political stance with the US. And also, if they are, and South Africa is at risk of being booted out because of our current standing in these two wars, should we even want to sign up to a pact that essentially says that we don't necessarily have a mind of our own when it comes to geopolitics?
Well, we don't have that much of a say in this. We can send delegations to Washington to try and persuade the Americans to keep us designated, but the real okay, so it's a law. AGOA is a set of legislative tools. So if it is renewed, it's going to be up to Congress to do that. So that's the two houses of Parliament in America, and it's so the question now is these people like Koens and Risch who want the legislature to have more influence on the executive, because the way things happen at the moment, it is the prerogative of the US president to designate or not a country for eligibility under the benefits. So I reckon this is what we're going to see, is that they're going to say, okay, we'll extend it, but then we want some kind of a say in how you, the president, you do these designations.
Okay. Azar, your thoughts here? I mean, some of the key takeaways that have come out or that are under consideration regarding the extended AGOA and what it may or may not look like. I mean, there are suggestions that the extension period should be beyond 10 years. That was currently the current term to 16, and I'm interested in what kind of a difference you think that would make. There are also suggestions that we need to review all the a lot of the African countries are wanting the review of eligibility of countries to be made every 3 years as opposed to annually. And also there are some discussions around graduation and countries that eventually become more middle income earning and upper income earning, how long they graduate or stay in the program for. Just your thoughts then on some of those issues, the new elements that are being reviewed, and what do you think a win-win looks like?
Without a doubt, I think the fact that the AGOA conference went on in Johannesburg and was agreed to by the United States, and there was a lot of American presence in it, speaks to the fact that the United States is very keen to extend AGOA. And there's a very simple reason why they want to do that. In recent years, they have seen Chinese and Russian influence increasing enormously on the African continent. And they want to find a way of countering this. And AGOA is an outstanding way of actually keeping some American influence on the continent. And I think that's the driving force, and why I think the United States is keen to persist with AGOA. They have obviously taken action against 4 countries for abuse of human rights, and they regard that far worse than South Africa basically conducting independent foreign policy. They've got to be very careful in, well, we had the Lady R story, and South Africa sent a delegation, and we were told that everything was sorted out, and that was no longer a huge issue in terms of preventing the United States from keeping South Africa as part of the AGOA agreement. You've got to realize that South Africa's participation in AGOA has been by far the biggest of the entire continent. I think it's accounted for nearly half of the benefit that the United States has. I think, well, maybe not half. I think the figures are that the value of goods exported to the United States under AGOA is of the order of $10 billion a year, and South Africa's share of that is about $3 billion a year, which is substantial, I suppose. And it's really a way of just maintaining influence, American influence, in this country, which is not totally unimportant for them. And for that reason, I'm not particularly dismayed by some of the actions being taken by the 2 American legislators. The other thing to bear in mind is that as regards South Africa's stance on Palestine, that has basically irked some of the Americans. But, you know, we are not alone.
Sure.
Countries within the G7 themselves are very disturbed by Israel's actions in Palestine, none less so than Japan itself, that wants to the G7 to adopt a very balanced approach towards this. And we've seen, as a consequence, very little emanating from the G7 in terms of giving guidance as to what G7 countries should be doing in that regard. So
Sure.
It's not cut and dried as to whether the United States really is completely adamant that South Africa's stance in supporting Palestine is completely off the wall.
Sure.
And the last thing to state is that it's interesting that these 2 legislators are from the Republican Party. And this throws into the ring, and that's been kind of hinted at by your previous speakers, the importance of the US presidential outcome next year. If the Democrats are victorious, there's no question that AGOA, South Africa's participation in AGOA, will be sustained. With the Republicans, it's probable that it will be sustained, but there's just less certainty in that regard.
Sure, I mean...
But overall, just bear in mind, the impact on the South African economy is relatively small from a direct point of view. $3 billion worth of exports amount to a fraction of South Africa's total exports. Secondly, just bear in mind that the bigger negative impact is the indirect impact that it might have in terms of sending a negative signal to US investors to be a little more cautious about investing in South Africa. Okay. And it's in that sense that I think the potential negative impact on the economy is greatest. But okay. It's not a massive deal. It's really United States competing against China through AGOA, and I don't believe that they're going to give this benefit, this potential source of influence up very easily.
Okay, so that's at a government level then, I would argue, in terms of the influence that AGOA gives the US in Africa, and the sort of position of comfort that perhaps the US is able to feel as they see other parties, particularly China, also wooing Africans as friends. But what about at the business level, Azar? Because you did mention investors, and you mentioned the indirect signal that it could bring if South Africa is not part of AGOA, in that sense, how it could be interpreted as a negative investment signal. Because I want to ask you about whether you see AGOA as having had an economic opportunity also for these investors, and whether you reckon that they are looking further down the track and looking at the Africa Free Trade Continental Area deal and the market opportunity that could present as a reason for wanting to ensure the continuation of AGOA, in your view. Just your quick thoughts on the economic opportunity from an investor level.
From an investor level, there's no doubt that AGOA has been beneficial to a handful of industries in South Africa, most notably, and by far the most important being the automotive industry. Secondly, you've had the citrus and wine industries as well. But it is what is being attempted now is to widen the net of products that would fall under AGOA. And these discussions wouldn't be talking about that were it not for the fact that the United States is very interested in trying to extend its sphere of influence. As to whether this will affect investment sentiment towards South Africa, I think that it is a factor, but I think there are many, many other factors that also come into play there. Most importantly, whether South Africa's government is managing the fiscal situation appropriately, or whether these investors in South African government bonds stand to be faced with a loss, a default on their bonds if we carry on overspending relative to what we get in revenue and keep over borrowing. That's a far more important issue than AGOA on its own.
Okay. Eckart, I'll give you the last word, sir. Just in terms of wrapping up the discussion on what a better AGOA looks like, particularly for Africa, what would you say?
Well, I think what is important to note is that the thoughts were about just extending AGOA or improving AGOA. And one certain improvement that is being circulated at the moment is, as was mentioned just now, retrofitting or dovetailing the African Continental Free Trade Area into AGOA preferences. And it's allowing for sourcing of North African inputs to be considered as originating, as locally made products, for further processing as AGOA eligible products. So that is certainly a very positive outcome. And maybe just lastly, on the review that is out, or that is part of this this proposal now, that South Africa would be subject to an out-of-cycle review. I don't think it is anything in particular to worry about. Remember, in 2015, when the AGOA legislation was extended the last time, we were facing exactly the same thing. We were also subject to an out-of-cycle review, and an out-of-cycle review can happen at any point going forward anyway, whether it happens now or in 5 years' time or in 3 years' time. That can happen at any point in time. What is important is that we remain compliant in terms of the eligibility criteria, and if one looks at the eligibility criteria in an objective manner, I don't think that there's too much to be complained about. I think these are all fairly reasonable criteria and quite understandable from where they come from.
All right. Gentlemen, we'll have to park the conversation there. I imagine a lot to pick up on further as the discussions do continue to take place behind the scenes around the extension and also what it looks like in the new term. And hopefully we'll catch up with you as those discussions do continue. But for now, thanks so much for your time. I was in conversation with Azar Jammine, Director and Chief Economist over at Econometrix, François Conradie, Lead Political Economist from Oxford Economics Africa, Andre Snyders, Industry Specialist at Standard Bank Research, as well as Eckart Naumann, Economist over at Tralac. And that wraps up the Power Table.
This program is in partnership with NetBank Commercial Banking, a banking partner that thinks bigger to guide your business growth.